Welcome everyone. Buenas tardes. This autumn quarter is 60 years since this center was founded. For those of you who haven't met, my name is Hector Hoyos. I'm the faculty director. Thank you for coming. I hope this is not just your first class talk of the quarter, but the first of several, that this becomes part of your weekly rituals, that you check out the calendar and feel like this is something that you want to learn more about. When this center was established, its mandate said we were to, quote, strengthen access to and training in the major languages of Latin America and broaden Latin America area studies training across all disciplines as a national resource center. Since then, we have evolved into a premier hub for interdisciplinary research on the region. This year, we welcome a new cohort of 7 master's students. And I'm going to do a bit of a cast of characters here, who is who. So I want to ask you to please raise your hand when I mention your name so we can acknowledge you. We're going to be calling on students and affiliates and fellows and so on. Kimberly Arriaga Gonzalez. Aranza Caudillo Álvarez. Diana Saraí Cisneros. Acabo de llegar. Okay, perfect. Mirka Odalis Cruz. Luca de Cola. Lucía Huerta Torres. Y Lisette Montañez Hurtado. Right, fantastic. We also have 2 undergraduate students in the Latin American Studies minor program who I don't think made it today. Li Chang from Economics and Kendall Dowd from IR, International Relations. Class Tinker Dissertation Completion Fellows for the year are Olavo Passos de Souza, Olavo, a historian of 19th century Brazil, and Ruben Diaz Vasquez, a scholar of indigeneity in Mexico, who will also be serving as a peer mentor this year, alongside, if you're here, please let us know, Valeria Gracia Olvera. Valeria, who is a health policy expert, and one returning peer mentor, Cristian Robles Baez, a historian who is probably dashing and is going to be late. He also got an award, but I won't mention it just yet until he's here. No, I will. He's a John Robensky Fellow in International Business and Economic History, and we're very proud. We are delighted to welcome as well Tinker Postdoctoral Fellow Clara Vicay. Clara. Our very first postdoc, a very rigorous selections, over 150 applicants across fields. She's a political scientist from UC Berkeley, working among other subjects on quilombos in Brazil. Later this quarter, we will welcome 2 Luxich visiting scholars, faculty at Universidad de Chile and Adolfo Ibáñez, respectively, the chemist, Carlos Manzano, that's the first for this interdisciplinary center, and the legal scholar, Mayra Fetters. Thank you to their Stanford faculty sponsors. Please continue to bring amazing people to our attention. I'd also like to share that in the summer of 2026, we will offer a unique opportunity for high school and community college science teachers to develop curricula and study life sciences in the Galapagos Islands with Professor Emeritus Bill Durham, who is probably watching on his laptop. Hello, Bill. This immersive professional development experience is part of our dedicated outreach efforts under Title VI. We are grateful for federal funding and hope it will resume. This year, the Cuba Observatory will be led by Professor Lisa Sorwillo, and our new Director of Graduate Studies is Professor Rebecca Tadlau, who will also introduce our speaker in a moment. I'll share more updates about our formidable Tinker visiting professors in the winter and spring. For now, please mark your calendars for Friday, December 5th, Friday, December 5th, the Friday of week 10. Don't buy those plane tickets. Be here for the 60th anniversary conference, where we have partnered up with political scientists, historians, biologists. We have some really formidable speakers coming in, members of the diplomatic body, and it will be an occasion for reflection, to mark that milestone and to think where we all want to take the center in the next 60 years. So please make it a point of being here. The food is going to be so lavish. Thank you for joining us today. The floor is Professor Ackerman.
It's going to take me a minute. But a big clap first. So hi everyone. Lots of familiar faces. Great to be here. I could not be more honored to introduce our first class speaker of the year, Dr. Edwin Ackerman. Dr. Ackerman is an associate professor of sociology at Syracuse University in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where he also serves as a senior research associate in the program in Latin America and the Caribbean, and an undergrad director of the Sociology department. Methodologically, Dr. Ackerman's research is comparative and historical, and thematically, it focuses on the articulation of politics and identity, analyzing a range of pressing topics. For example, Dr. Ackerman has examined the history of debates over migration in the United States, illustrating how despite decades of unauthorized migration, the 1970s marked a critical juncture where illegality became for the first time a central concern. A shift pushed forward not by right-wing groups, but rather the convergence of interest of both Border Patrol bureaucrats seeking more resources, and ironically, a variety of progressive organizations, including some labor unions, social service organizations, and ethnic-based organizations, who saw the interests of their constituencies in conflict with the needs of unauthorized migrants. Edwin's first book, which I forgot to bring, I wish I could show it to you all, is called The Origins of the Mass Party, Dispossession and the Party Form in Mexico and Bolivia. And this book also examines the articulation of politics and identity through a study of the formation of Mexico's Party of the Institutionalized Revolution, the PRI, in the 1930s and 1940s, and Bolivia's Revolutionary Nationalist Movement, MNR, in the 1950s and 1960s. He draws on comparative and historical methods to understand why mass party formation was successful in Mexico, but not in Bolivia, making yet another counterintuitive argument that it is in locations where more dispossession of communal land holdings took place, which was the case of Mexico, that it was actually easier for parties to articulate diverse constituencies into a unified bloc. Beyond this historical puzzle, his analysis helps us reflect on the conditions under which mass-based political parties remain possible today. Edwin's current research analyzes the histories of right-wing mobilizations against so-called gender ideologies throughout the Americas. Yet another very timely topic, given the ongoing battles over teaching gender and sexuality in schools, including the recent firing of Texas A&M faculty member Kathy McColl for teaching a lesson on gender identity that featured a non-binary character. On a more personal note, I've known Edwin since 2009, when we were both graduate students at UC Berkeley, and where our friendship was forged not only over academic seminars, but in the context of student activism. I still remember sitting on Sproul Plaza with huge pieces of butcher paper, brainstorming late into the night with Edwin and others about what type of university and society we wanted to create. That experience really revealed a quality that has run throughout Edwin's work, a passion for using social analysis to imagine a better world. Whether he's studying the history of popular understandings of undocumented immigration, the formation of mass political parties, or right-wing political movements, his objective is to study history to inform contemporary choices about effective politics. And it is no surprise then that Edwin's voice is sought for far beyond academia. When Mexican President López Obrador was ending his term in office, who did Democracy Now!'s Amy Goodman call to understand AMLO's legacy? Edwin Ackerman. And when President Claudia Sheinbaum hit her 100-day mark in office, she called him again. And today, as President Sheinbaum's presidency approaches its one-year milestone, we are so privileged to have a front row seat to hear what Dr. Edwin Ackerman has to say about class politics and the electoral left in Mexico, and for the academics in the room to learn how rigorous historical sociology can illuminate the challenges of our current moment. So on that note, please.
Thanks so much, Vicky. Thanks so much for the introduction. I'm really really honored to be here. I should say, when they asked me for a photograph, I didn't realize it was going to be that prominent. I was telling Becky I was about to wear the exact same shirt. I'm glad I didn't wear it. But I should also confess, embarrassingly, that was a 10-year-old picture. So I'm glad it's not there anymore. So you can't be comparing one to one. Again, thank you for the invitation, for the introduction, and I'm really honored to be here today. So I want to talk about some work that's in progress, right, around the issue of corruption and anti-corruption movements, and as the title says, it's the class politics of it all, right? So briefly, let me just kind of give you a quick sense, although I think Becky did a really good job at this, explaining how I became interested in this subject, right? So the original focus of my academic work involved understanding the conditions for parties to form, to emerge. And one of the implications from what became my first book, Origins of the Mass Party, was that historically processes of capitalist dislocation set the conditions of possibility for mass political articulation. And this left the question open somewhat of whether this applied to neoliberalism, which has been thought of, I think, extensively as actually complicating political organization. It was, I think, with that in mind that I began to follow particularly closely the rise of the electoral left in contemporary Mexico, particularly after it came to power in 2018. And I have been writing about it for some years now, focusing, I would say, perhaps more on conjunctural questions, but I'm interested now in stepping back and beginning to draw some broader implications of what has happened, right? And I hope to begin to do that here today. So I very much look forward to hearing your comments, your questions, and your criticisms as well. So let me give you a very quick sense of the current state of the electoral left in Mexico. So President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO for short, finished his 6-year term from 2018 to 2024 with very high approval ratings, right? Averaging 70%, with one poll by Gallup, for example, at the end of his term, putting him at the 80% approval. And currently, his successor and longtime political protege, Claudia Sheinbaum, completing her first year in office, has similarly very high approval rate. Sheinbaum, should be said, also achieved a landslide victory in the presidential elections last year, garnering close to 60% of the vote, more than 30 percentage points ahead of the runner-up. The main opposition parties, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, the National Action Party, the PAN, and the PRD, which run together as a coalition this time last year, it lost significant ground compared to 2018, securing about 27% of the vote, around a 10 percentage drop in their combined total to the previous election. Morena, the party founded by AMLO, formed just over a decade ago, secured in that last election a 2/3 majority in the Chamber of Congress, fell one representative short of achieving the same thing in the Senate. Right? So in essence, a 2/3 majority in Congress and Senate. So how should we understand the success of the electoral left in contemporary Mexico? And what I'm going to be suggesting throughout here is that a key element in understanding this story is to study the trajectory of anti-corruption politics in the country. And what I want to do today is outline 3 broad points. The first will be that the distinctive feature comparatively and historically of AMLO's project is his progressive reframing of anti-corruption politics. I'll trace, however, schematically, the electoral left in the context of the period of the so-called transition to democracy that began in the late 1990s, when the PRI, which had governed for most of the 20th century, loses its grip on power for the first time. The argument here will be that the right was able to capitalize on this process of transition. So that the struggle against the PRI and against PRI corruption came to be equated with a general anti-statism, lending neoliberalism a pro-democratic, even anti-establishment edge in this period. And it would take a quarter century for the electoral left to cut through with a redistributive program that casts neoliberalism itself as corruption. And in line with that, the second point I'm going to make today is that this platform that the left develops, that the electoral left develops, is premised on a very specific diagnosis of corruption that diagnoses it as a specific neoliberal political economy. That is not a series of scandals or isolated scandals or say moral failings, but a particular logic of capital accumulation. And the third and final point, trying to piece some of these things together, is that I think it would be useful to think about AMLO's tenure as inaugurating a post-neoliberal rather than anti-neoliberal era, right? A reshaping of the relationship between state and market in a society already deeply transformed by decades of neoliberalism. So what we're seeing, I'll suggest, is the emergence of a new political regime reliant on a new post-neoliberal social. The project of the electoral left here is simply, if you will, to re-legitimize the state as a social actor and to reignite class politics. It aims, in other words, to revamp a developmentalist state, but to do so assuming that certain key features of neoliberal discourse and practice, such as global free trade, foreign investment-led growth, and macroeconomic orthodoxy, are irreversible, at least in the short and midterm. And furthermore, its emerging attributes are constrained by the structural limits imposed by decades of neoliberalism itself, concretely, the inheritance of a hollowed out state apparatus and a disarticulated working class. So let me begin with the first point here. AMLO's administration was a late example of the pink type governments, right, that swept South America beginning in the late 90s, early 2000s. While the tide has experienced its ebbs and flows in recent years, it never reached Mexico during its height. And this is puzzling, actually, because the often cited factors that are cited to explain the left turn in South America, for example, the confluence of third-wave democratization with increased poverty, with anemic growth associated with neoliberalism of the 80s and 90s, all of those elements were also present in Mexico. Now, while these conditions set the stage for the left to sweep in South America during that period, in Mexico, this context led to 3 neoliberal center-right governments beginning in the year 2000, and 2 decades of electoral defeat of the left. So understanding AMLO's rise requires an account of this critical period of failure. Now, the PRI, notorious for embracing a broad ideological umbrella, ruled Mexico without interruption from 1929 to the year 2000. And while the government routinely practiced electoral fraud and resorted to violent crackdowns on opposition, it also created a dense network of corporatist clientelist relations, enabling it to co-opt emerging grassroots worker and peasant leaders. In other words, the sectors theoretically most prone to oppositional left-leaning mobilization were already organized under the PRI, were already co-opted and captured under the PRI. A key Mexican Marxist thinker of the 60s, Jose Revueltas, I think, explained it well when he wrote that the working masses, quote, participate in a real and effective way in the activities of the bourgeois party of the PRI because, aside from compulsion, in the worst of cases, they believe that at least they're not doing it for the party itself, but for the union of which they are members. The party, he contended, quote, can penetrate its organizational filaments all the way to the deepest layers of the population and thus impede the development of class politics. This And this had a severe effect on the political organization of the electoral left. As a consequence of this particular mode of PRI rule, Mexico's electoral left, developed without a social base of its own and without a fully formed program of its own. We could call this a stunted development of the electoral left, which is perhaps, interestingly enough, best captured by AMLO's own political trajectory. Part of why it is hard for observers to place AMLO in the cartography of political ideologies, arguments abound, inside and outside the country over whether he is left-wing or not. Part of, I think, what adds to this complication is that his political path is, in a sense, entirely peculiar to 20th century Mexico. That is, he does not come from the socialist or social democratic left like European counterparts, does not come from militant union activism like Lula or Evo Morales in South America. Rather, López Obrador was a member of the PRI early in his career, when the organization, which was the heir, after all, of an early 20th century agrarian revolution, still contained within it a strong nationalist progressive wing that would, of course, later break off. Now, the PRI during the 20th century presided over a mixed state market economy. As the party consolidated power through corporatist arrangement, state enterprises and union leadership became synonymous with wasteful mismanagement and corruption. In the 80s and 90s, active opposition parties, in particular the conservative PAN, became strong advocates of privatization, arguing that dismantling the network of corruption that drained public resources required breaking the state's monopolistic hold on certain sectors of the economy and opening them up to market competition. The discourse then of privatization and union busting in Mexico came paired with an idiosyncratic veneer of democratization, as anti-PRI forces were ideologically organized around forms of free market fundamentalism or dogmatism. The PAN then governs the country between the year 2000 and 2012. The electoral left of the period is hence poorly placed to take advantage of that anti-authoritarian sentiment that coalesces against the PRI at the turn of the century. Now, a fully neoliberalized PRI then would retake power in 2012 and govern until 2018 when AMLO wins the presidency. Now, public debate during the 2018 electoral contest was dominated by the issue of corruption. PRI president on his way out, Peña Nieto, left office with the lowest approval rating on record at 24 percentage points. And this dismal figure reflected, among other things, the widespread discontent stemming from a series of high-profile corruption scandals that came to define his administration. So anti-corruption became the principal component of AMLO's campaign discourse and subsequently, as we'll see, of his economic program. Central to this was his claim that neoliberalism was defined by corruption. As he put it in his inaugural speech, this is why he insists that the hallmark of neoliberalism is corruption. It sounds harsh, but privatization in Mexico has been synonymous with corruption. Unfortunately, this malady has almost always existed in our country, but what happened during the neoliberal period is unprecedented in modern times. The system as a whole has operated for corruption. Political power and economic power have mutually fed and nurtured each other, and the theft of the people's goods and the nation's wealth has been established as the modus operandi. What distinguishes AMLO's anti-corruption discourse here is the connection he makes to neoliberalism. Now, conventionally, anti-corruption efforts, not only in the country, but in many other places, including many cases in Latin America, it had been traditionally championed by sectors of the neoliberal right, backed mostly by middle and upper classes. These anti-corruption movements tended to have, again, a sort of anti-statist quality to them. And perhaps you could even argue a sort of anti-politics elements to it in general. So what AMLO is doing here is conceptualizing corruption as a central component to a specific political economy. Here, corruption is not understood as merely a series of individual crimes or isolated scandals. It's a consequence of the reconfiguration of state economy over the past decades. Corruption, as he puts it, became integral to a regime of private accumulation by way of the state. AMLO's read here is based in turn on a diagnosis of the characteristics of, I would call it, actually existing neoliberalism in Mexico, which differs from those of neoliberalism in the abstract. In this view, neoliberalism produced a sort of reverse rentier state, where government officials and a complex network of contractors siphoned off public funds through various mechanisms, not always illegal, that range from the outsourcing of government functions to, in extreme cases, the creation of parallel shell companies for tax evasion. So neoliberalism in practice, actually existing neoliberalism, was not a simple separation between the state and the market, but in fact a re-instrumentalization of the state in the service of private profit. AMLO insisted that this is the concrete form taken by neoliberalism in Mexico. For instance, in a February 2021 press conference, he argued, quote, in our country, capital accumulation didn't necessarily arise from bourgeois exploitation of workers, but from corruption. It intensified in the neoliberal period. This isn't dismissing Marxism as an analytical lens, but acknowledging that Mexico's case is special. Now, this conceptualization contrasts with the more conventional notions whereby business elites compete in the shadows through graft for market-oriented investment opportunities and other perks and competitive advantages. The conglomeration here of politicians and companies dependent on government contracts can be understood, in fact, as a specific class fraction within Mexican neoliberalism, in the sense that, in a literal sense, that their profits are not derived from surplus over investment in production or sale of goods or services in the free market, but from the extraction, the level of connection to public resources. Right? So a form of capital accumulation dependent, again, not on surplus over investment, but on public resources. Give me a second. Now, this perspective is diametrically opposed to the dominant opinion of past decades in the country that vision associated with the so-called democratic transition that begins in the year 2000 and understood, as I mentioned before, neoliberal reforms explicitly or implicitly as an anti-corruption tool. As I laid out earlier, much of neoliberalism's expansion in Mexico progressed hand in hand with gradual democratization in the 90s and early 2000s, as the PRI begins to lose its grip and power. With the PRI presiding over a mixed economy for much of the 20th century, state enterprises, corporatism, union leaders had become synonymous with corruption. Proponents of privatization argued, among other things, that dismantling the web of corruption required eliminating the state's relative monopoly over certain economic sectors. The free market would leave union leaders and administrators of the state-owned companies without illegal sources of income. In AMLO's framing, however, it is precisely the neoliberal period that enabled corruption. Beginning in the 90s, the state's functions were outsourced to private companies and organizations, fostering backroom deals, competition for privileged access to contracts, and the sale of state-owned enterprises. Two of the scandals of the Peña Nieto government highlight this view: the Estafa Maestra and the Odebrecht case. The Estafa Maestra, just very briefly, involved 11 federal agencies coordinating with public universities to evade budgetary oversight, since by law, government agencies, including universities, were able to obtain contracts for services for the state without bidding. And these universities would then, in the scheme, subcontract to private entities to deliver the services. The case of energy construction giant Odebrecht, with a trail of scandals throughout Latin America, it bribed its way to push support for the 2013 energy reforms, which expanded private investment in the state oil company. Now, despite public outrage over Peña Nieto's scandal, anti-corruption efforts at the time focused particularly on institutional redesign, most notably the 2015 constitutional reform creating the National Anti-Corruption System. Key proponents of the system viewed corruption's causes as, quote, norms, procedures, and decision-making environments, and hence advocating, quote, for redesigned institutional intelligence, end quote, to combat it. The business sector drove this anti-corruption reform process. Chambers of commerce and organizations like the Communications Council, the Voice of Business and Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity, which was led at the time by business magnate Claudio X. Gonzalez, who would later become one of AMLO's most prominent critics, played key roles in that reform process. The Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, once led by Juan Pardinas, who would later be the editorial director of the liberal right-wing newspaper Reforma, which was also one of the key opponents or critics during AMLO's tenure, also participated in this reform process. AMLO's linking of corruption and neoliberalism, however, suggested that a solution required more than a redesigning of public institutions, more than so-called institutional intelligence, that it required some sort of fundamental readjustment of state and market relations. Now, López Obrador declared that his victory in 2018 marked the dawn of a new political regime rather than merely a change in government. And central to this purported transformation was a departure from the neoliberal economic policies that have been dominant in Mexico for decades. In March 2019, a few months into his term, AMLO went as far as announcing officially the end of neoliberalism in the country. And, quote, the neoliberal model with its policies against the people of stealing and giving away public resources is hereby abolished, end quote. This bold statement sparked a lively debate on the extent of this abolition and what, if anything, has replaced neoliberalism. The transition away from neoliberalism under AMLO, I think, could be said to be moderate but significant. But rather than an outright rejection of the post-Keynesian order, AMLO's policies, I suggest, can be described more concretely or more accurately as post-neoliberal. And the term post-neoliberalism here captures two key aspects, I think, of AMLO's government. On the one hand, the strategic adoption of certain elements of neoliberal discourse and policy in some ironic way to mitigate neoliberalism's effects. I'll give some examples in a minute. And the practical negotiation of what was an anti-neoliberal agenda forged when Morena was a social movement, tempered once it was empowered by the realities of a nation transformed by neoliberalism itself in ways that could not be quickly or easily reversed. AMLO's post-neoliberalism aims to shape the relationship between state and market, specifically by re-legitimizing the state as a social actor, that is, reintroducing the idea that the state can do things, can do big things, and to reignite class politics. That's how I understand, again, the basic aims of the project. So let me take up the first of this aim, right? The return of the state. The flagship concept of AMLO's government was, perhaps sort of counterintuitively, the notion of Republican austerity. This was a case of a strategic adoption of neoliberal discourse used to combat neoliberalism itself. AMLO's Republican austerity aimed to dismantle the network of intermediaries between the state and the citizenry in public resource distribution. These networks, which included clientelist brokers, NGOs, trusts, referred to as fideicomisos, and private companies contracted by the state, were viewed as opaque, as redundant, as key bottlenecks for budgetary capture. Republican austerity was then meant to combat the process, you could say, of hollowing out of the state under neoliberalism. If not its outright contraction, it's hollowing out. Republican austerity should be distinguished from neoliberal austerity. Right? Under AMLO, the size of the state, for example, is judged by the number of federal government employees, in fact, grew slightly. Right? The same goes for funding for sectors as science, education, and health, which all had budgets that increased, however, minimal, right, or insufficiently, but there was no decrease in that sense. Right? And despite the economic crisis exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, social spending as a percentage of total government expenditure was the highest in the decade. AMLO's social programs reached 65% more people than those previous governments. And unlike the past micro-targeted, means-tested social programs, AMLO's programs, cash transfer programs, for example, adopted a universal rights-based approach. These programs, which are now enshrined in the Constitution, target broad subgroups like the elderly, students, and persons with disabilities, with very minimal conditions for access, right? Reflecting a shift from a focalized handout to the notion of a universal right. Now, many other things can be cited here in terms of how to think about the return of the state. I'll mention a couple here, although in the interest of time, I'll have to move somewhat quickly here. But I would mention, for example, the focus placed on the energy sector, and particularly its notion of energy sovereignty, which received, again, a lot of special attention under this period. Right? Not only efforts to revamp Pemex, the state-owned oil company, to revamp its productive capacity, right, to turn it into an engine of economic growth, something, by the way, challenged by low oil prices and also the imminent climate crisis. Additionally, AMLO moderately curbed the power of foreign mining companies, right? Not granting new concessions, revising existing concessions. Right? And the push, which wasn't ultimately successful in his term, but has been afterward, of new legislation around the electricity sector that gives, again, the state a prominent role in the electricity market. AMLO's administration took decisive steps to bolster the public sector's relative power. The example, again, of the energy sector is perhaps the clearest. But you see it as well in the whole series of very media-friendly so-called mega projects, which were state-led infrastructural projects that included trains, airports, refineries, and so forth, right? This in a break with, again, the previous decades of neoliberal restructuring were pushed on decisively non-neoliberal premises, such as public works. And although in some cases they involve some limited element of private-public partnership, these were projects led by the state, right? In many cases by the military, in non-controversial ways that I'm sure we'll have to talk about in the Q&A. One final thing I would point here is the changes in tax policy. Right? Again, despite managing macroeconomic variables conservatively, the administration focused on increasing the state's capacity for tax collection, even amid the economic challenges of the pandemic. One thing to note is that Mexico's collection rates are below the OECD and Latin American Caribbean averages. So enhancing tax collection, even without changing the current tax structure, effectively aims to mimic a progressive tax reform. And according to official figures, the new government increased tax collection from the wealthiest by more than 200%. Additionally, efforts were made to eliminate tax exemptions, often obtained through lobbying and legal maneuvers by large companies. The Financial Times, for example, described Raquel Buenrostro, which was at that moment the head of the IRS, as, quote, an iron lady cracking a whip on multinationals' houses. Now, the return of class politics. What do I mean by this, or how do I see it? I think the advancement, on a technical sense, of working class interests in Mexico during those 6 years is increasingly incontrovertible, actually, as the full picture of what transpired during that period has begun to emerge, right? As the data is now in our hands. Right? And the broad layout is this. During his term in office, real wages went up nearly 30%. Labor share of income compared to that of capital share of income. Labor share of income grew by 8 percentage points. This is the largest increase after decades of decline. The poorest 10% of workers saw their earnings nearly double, up 98%. Poverty dropped by 12%. This is by far the steepest decrease this quarter century, pulling more than 13 million people above the line. Inequality shrunk somewhat for the Gini coefficient. All this while producing the lowest unemployment rate in Latin America and even slightly ticking down work in the informal sector. And I should say, all this also, not only in the context of the crisis produced by the pandemic, inflation, but also a general period of slow growth or no growth at the economic level, right? Which gives us a sense of to what degree these victories or accomplishments are accomplishments credited to state policies. There has also been almost 200% increase in what's referred to as reparto de utilidades. This is a profit-sharing scheme that all workers were formerly entitled for years, but employers could previously easily circumvent by outsourcing their hires. So all in all, AMLO's administration achieved the lowest rate of the working poor, the most significant increase in the spending capacity of the poorest, and the highest taxes collected from the wealthiest in decades. Historic increases to the minimum wage, legislative reforms facilitating unionization, more mandated vacation days, recognition of domestic worker labor rights, all of this came to cement and define AMLO's project. Right? Broad unconditional cash transfers that I mentioned before already bolstered this backing. Now, the process by which labor reform to facilitate unionization that I mentioned was achieved illustrates the post-neoliberal rather than anti-neoliberal direction of AMLO's policies. And so let me just take a couple of minutes on that example. The labor reform was part of the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement during Donald Trump's presidency. Now, while Canadian delegations influenced by their own unions had long pressed for labor right clauses, previous Mexican delegations had resisted these clauses, arguing explicitly that Mexico's competitive advantage relied on low labor, on defending low labor. However, in late 2018, the outgoing Peña Nieto administration allowed President-elect López Obrador to assign attachés to the delegation negotiating the new agreement. Although the opportunity to revise the agreement was undoubtedly instigated by North American politicians and unions, AMLO could have adopted a class-neutral approach. Instead, he used this opportunity to advance labor rights, supporting these labor rights clauses, and arguing again explicitly to the domestic audience that the exchange for securing this new trade agreement depended on supporting the new labor legislation that would facilitate union production. Now, at the discursive level, we see this reemergence of class-based political discourse and agitation, right? And it's a significant break from the past. I think the mainstream political arena under neoliberalism promoted a language that pitted a loosely defined civil society against the state, which in turn conceded the need for greater citizen control over governance, ciudadanización. This discourse again sidelined class politics. Under AMLO's administration, however, there's a restoring of the language of class to the political arena. In a deep sense, the so-called democratic transition of the year 2000, with its conception of civil society and citizen and its understanding of politics as the search for technocratic fixes as opposed to the negotiation between social sectors with structurally defined interests, was in itself an ideological cover for the advancement of the interests of the upper classes. And perhaps not surprisingly, the electorate has become increasingly polarized along clear class lines. Now, in the 2018 elections, working class support was actually dispersed across various parties, including those in the neoliberal, while AMLO had significant support from middle-class professionals. However, by the 2021 midterms, we already started to see a reconfiguration of the electoral base. Exit polls by leading newspapers, for example, showed this shift consistently. To cite an example, in 2018, by one of these exit polls, in 2018, 48% of college-educated voters supported Morena's congressional candidates compared to only 33% in 2021. So a drop in that base of support, which was made up in the other direction. Conversely, support from voters with only elementary education rose from 42% in 2018 to 55% in 2021. Polling towards the end of his term revealed that AMLO's strongest support came from employees, the informal sector, and the peasants, and his biggest detractors from the business sector and college-educated professionals. Increasingly, business leaders such as Claudio X. González, or former Coparmex head Gustavo de Hoyos, or much more recently, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, are now openly organizing in the political arena on the basis of class interest, right? Their class interest. Now, without formal party ties, these leaders finance campaigns, draft talking points, set the conditions for party coalitions, which again intensifies the class cleavage of contemporary Mexican politics. Now, the exit polls in the last presidential election, right, when Sheinbaum enters into power, show a similar dynamic at hand. Sheinbaum won 66% of those with elementary level education and 65% of the lowest income bracket. but only 43% of those with college-educated education and 50% of the top income bracket. So her victory was, big enough that she, of course, captures most demographic groups, but the gap between them in the levels of support is still quite significant and quite telling. Right? And again, there's a lot of data that is consistent with this basic layout here, which again, I'll sort of skip in the interest of time. So let me begin closing. I want to point out, right, that I see the Mexican case as important for several intellectual efforts that deal with global phenomena outside of the country, right? That is, with recent intellectual efforts around rethinking neoliberalism, post-neoliberalism, and corruption, for that matter. In recent years, I think there's interest that has grown around the question of what neoliberalism is or was in practice as opposed to in theory. That is, the question of actually existing neoliberalism has now clearly come to the forefront, accompanied by a series of inquiries into whether neoliberalism across the world differed in practice from neoliberalism in the Western core, whether it is accurate to say that the state really contracted during the period, or if it was actually retooled in new and specific ways, and whether market and state were really separated or merged even more than during the Keynesian period. Interesting that this set of questions is emerging more clearly just when a variety of post-neoliberal regimes begins to take shape around the world. A key element in understanding the story, again, is to study the trajectory of anti-corruption politics, and in that sense, the Mexican case is key. Right? So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ackerman. Thank you in advance also for fielding questions. And in a time-honored tradition, the priority goes to our MA students. And this time around, we have a list of questions that our students have submitted in advance. And so I have invited our speaker to choose a couple of those questions and to kick off by answering them, if you would mind.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you everyone that submitted all these questions. Really, all of them are really interesting. I'll try and pick a couple that I think I can speak more clearly to. I had a question here that asked about militarization, right? This is a question from Mirka Cruz that asked, how do you balance wanting the country to progress while not gaining an increasing reliance on militarization? As I hinted, I think at some point in the talk here, this is a very important issue, right? So let me say a couple of things about how I think about the role of the military in all of this. So first, a bit of context about what is meant here by militarization in this question, right? So many of the, particularly the infrastructure projects that were carried out under AMLO, some of the famous ones are the Tren Maya, right? The train that goes around the Yucatan Peninsula, the new airport in Mexico City, a refinery, and a few others. Right? These were built by the state, right? But concretely by a branch of the state, which is the military. Now, that from its inception introduced a series of sort of thorny debates around the question of giving power, even if it's just budgetarily speaking, to the military. Right? Now, what was the government's argument for relying on the military to do this? Now, AMLO himself had been critical of processes of militarization of around public safety before he took office. Right? There was a record of, again, a critique of the increasing role of the military beyond its traditional roles in the country's history, at least during the 20th century. Right? So his increased reliance during his term on the military for carrying out these projects, it came to be seen, at least by some analysts, as a sort of contradictory move. Right? The argument, again, presented by the administration to do this was, in essence, that the state apparatus that it had inherited was dilapidated. In other words, introduces a puzzle or a challenge that is interesting for any sort of movement interested in pushing back against neoliberalism around the world. You get to power after decades of neoliberalism. The state itself has been transformed by that process. So that even carrying out something as basic as cash transfer programs isn't as easy because, again, at the administrative level, there is no apparatus in place to do so. So what AMLO, as he had, he himself sort of put it in several of his conferences, came to realize was that the military was an underused, relatively cheap and highly effective state apparatus. So that's what was this behind the decision to transfer this obligations to the military. Now, I should say the obligations don't just involve the construction of this mega project, but also their day-to-day administration. And even more than that, in some of these cases, the profits that come from those mega projects, for example, in the case of the Tren Maya, those are directly pegged to the retirement funds of the military. So they have a vested interest as well in the actual profits emerging from it. So it's not a simple sort of turnover for the sake of construction. This isn't the same as, for example, the American Corps of Engineers. Right? It's not exactly the same. It is much more significant. Now, the debates around it are, in a sense, obvious, right? Which is, what is the level of acceptable sacrifice, turning over or increasing the control, the power of the military in a regional context, right? In which the military has historically not proven to be loyal to democracy, right? To put it in. That's not particularly, I should say, the history of 20th century Mexico, right? Which famously, as Vargas Llosa put it, was perfect dictatorship because it did not require a military dictatorship as those of the Southern Cone. But that said, the question is still, still emerged. Right? The question was, are they eventually going to figure out increasing ways of having an in government policies? Are they gonna become interested in reshaping government policies to increase the amount of projects or budget that goes with it? Are they going to be increasingly isolated from accountability measures? Now, in a sense, there's no concrete answer to that question because it's really more of a, let's say, a worry of future development. I think the worry is a legitimate worry, but I think there's also some countervening tendencies that ironically give a sense that although quite possible that this extension of power can result in some sort of counterproductive consequences, it's not the only possible outcome. So some of the countervening tendencies that I would point to is that in an ironic sense, the bringing of the military into the mega projects actually put them into the media spotlight like never before in the country's history. Right? These elements of the military now had to do press conferences, respond to journalistic inquiries, that is, justify their work in a way much more open, relatively speaking, than the entire 20th century, ironically, right? In which they were able to operate really in the shadows. But the other, I think you could say, a positive countervening tendency is that it has been the case that once those projects have been completed, right, the budget that was assigned to the military has declined. So one of the big concerns that critics of that would point to is look at the budget of the military over those 6 years. It balloons. Right? Now, it was ballooning because they were building all these things, right? As they complete them, the budgets have been going back to their pre 2018 level without much pushback from the military. One final thing I would note here is very recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was a big sting, anti-corruption sting within the Marines that involved some high-ranking level members of the Marines. I mean, need to get into the specifics, but the point is it involved high-ranking members of the Marines. Like never before, really, higher echelons of the Marines had to come out and accept that had happened under the watch. People in jail, demissions, and so forth, right? And a general, let's say, vow of that the authority rests on the executive. So no attempt to circumvent the power of the executive. So I see those again as countervailing tendencies to the very real question of what are the acceptable sacrifices here in terms of turning some power over to the military.
I want to suggest that maybe we save another of the student questions for later. Thank you, Mika, for that question. And maybe the floor is open to other questions that might be in the audience. Evan?
First of all, thank you for this incredibly interesting talk. Really, really great to see you just lay this out in such an interesting way. One thing that I'm thinking a lot about, both just from reading and also just anecdotally from some of my own traveling in South America, is thinking about how starting like kind of with the pink tide and kind of off and on of these past 20 years, a big function of like the downfall of some of these center-left or left-wing parties often has been their whether perceived or real or somewhere in between, of corruption. Like I remember I've talked to a lot of like people in Argentina when they talk about like, oh, Cristina, and then just to Lisa and how corrupt she is and how she's in jail, rightly or wrongly, but that's definitely part of the perception of that. Evo Morales, 20, and his party, MAS, 20 years, Lula and all that stuff. But obviously all these, each of these cases are distinct, but I guess what now seeing Morena as having this anti-corruption as part of their platform, as part of their rise, what tools do they have to prevent basically these, or do they, or what could they do to prevent that same kind of thing, right, to their own market?
Edwin, would you like me to take 2 or 3 questions?
Okay,
at a time?
yeah, I wrote down, but yeah.
Yes, and then allow. This is
So this is really a follow-up. So what one of the things in the reading you're giving us is about the success of AMLO to be able to create like a blanket generalization. So there's no distinction between governments and PRI Peña Nieto. For example, in my mind, there's no question that the Peña Nieto government was much more corrupt than the two governments. But these are very contested issues because corruption always happens, obscurely, you don't know. And in some ways, also the PRI with no neoliberalism was incredibly corrupt. And there's all the testimonies. So there's one part of the argument here, which is, are you making an argument that limits itself to this is how AMLO successfully created this discourse? Or do you believe this is the reality of the link between corruption and neoliberalism?
Right.
And finally, in this round, Olavo.
I wanted to thank you for the presentation. This is fascinating. It's so interesting to see comparisons between Mexico and Brazil, which, I'm from, and just seeing like the same trends of neoliberalism and its weaponization of anti-corruption, and now this pushback to AMLO, and then seeing the different role of the military is fascinating because very different cases. But it talks about a policy of one model that I just wanted to like get a better sense on, which you described as Republican austerity. And I was trying to understand more like how was that implemented? Is that a state cutting off the private sector? An ironic twist on the idea of austerity. I'm just trying to get a better sense of that because it seems to be a very interesting response to the previous arrangement that it would be sent. Just trying to compare it to Brazil.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you for all those questions. Let me begin with the second question just because I have it more sort of at the top of my mind here, right? So as I understand, what you're asking me is, am I making an argument simply, let's say that I'm whispering here and telling you this is what the government, how the government understood it, justified it, and so forth, and to some degree, could make the case that's a useful contribution. In fact, very useful if you see some of the level of kind of debate in the country that often actually ignores this, right? Or whether I'm suggesting that this was in fact, a successful fighting of corruption, right? That's how I understood the question. I would say two things here, right? The first is that in a strict sense, I think what this shows us is that the notion of corruption is fundamentally a political discourse, right? That can be fielded or extended in particular ways. Right? It was the case when anti-corruption was led by neoliberal forces, and it's the case in the present, right? That it has that power to capture all these phenomena that perhaps in a colder analytical sense you would want to separate, right? And perhaps it would be more accurate to say, that the specific sort of neoliberal corruption that's different than the specific sort of, let's call it Keynesian corruption or whatever, you want to refer to how you want to refer to the pre-neoliberal age, right? And I think, in fact, that would be very useful, and it's one of the things that I'm interested in doing based on this, right? To think more neatly about what are the different phenomena captured underneath this label, which again, to me, is fundamentally exists at the level of political discourse. Mm-hmm. Now, as I try to emphasize, what I'm really trying to argue is that that what characterizes what differentiates AMLO's project historically and relatively speaking is this progressive bent to the anti-corruption movement, which again, if you compare it to the conventional ways in which anti-corruption movements develop, they tend to have an anti-statist element to it. Again, you could even say an anti-politics element to it, right? And just sectorally tend to come from the middle and upper classes, right? None of that is present here, and that to me, is the sort of real phenomenon to be looking at. Now, that said, I actually do think that there's something to the idea that neoliberalism and corruption are linked, and the way I think about it is this way: that in fact, AMLO is mistaken in saying that that's specific to Mexico. Whereas, in fact, it could be a good description of neoliberalism in many other parts of the world. Right? In that, what we're seeing, and this isn't entirely my argument, is that in the neoliberal phase, because of the deep crisis of decline of the rate of profit, depends on how much you want to get into it, but given the deep crisis of capitalism, increasingly, the neoliberal phase is defined by increased merging of politics and economics, in which increasingly the capacity for accumulation depends on government connections, right? That can take various different forms, right? Legal and illegal, right? From forms of lobbying. Some of those things are super obvious in the present administration here in the US, right, in which increasing connection to the state, like political connection, is a dependent variable for maintaining surplus, right? As opposed to, again, a traditional free market arrangement. So that too, I think, that analysis can be deepened from the starting, whether this in fact is only specific to Mexico. Okay, now the question of Republican austerity, yeah, I mean it's counterintuitive in some sense. I think it's meant to be counterintuitive. I think that's why the label Republican is attached to it, right, as opposed to neoliberal austerity, right? One of many concrete examples that I can think of this is, for example, the measures taken around the COVID pandemic, the economic measures. Right? There was pressure by the business sector in that period to receive forms of help or bailouts, right? As we saw in the U.S., right, and in many other parts of the world. The government actually refused to do that. It did other things, we can get into that, but it refused to do that particular thing. And there you find AMLO in a couple of moments in the conferences being very explicit and sort of tongue-in-cheek saying, I am neoliberal now. You want the government to bail you out, the separation of the state and the market, this is what you preach for. I am neoliberal. But in a general sense, it refers to cutting from the top, right? That there is a series of bureaucratic bottleneck capture, budgetary capture, bloating of sort of high administrative functions, as well as a whole process, as I referred to in the talk, of hollowing out the state, by which I mean outsourcing of government functions, in which it's not necessarily contraction of the state in the sense that at the level of spending, you would still see an amount of state spending devoted to a specific area. Right? You wouldn't necessarily see a transformation there during the neoliberal period, just at the level of the budget line. But who is actually carrying out those functions, it changes during the period, right? So increasingly, the state is a carpus that is still funding, right? But it's funding increasingly private purveyors of what used to be government services. So that's another element in which this comes to shine. And then the first question, which was the question of I guess of lawfare. That's what you're pointing to. I mean, so I would say a couple of things here first. There's obviously important similarities between these movements. They understand themselves as part of one same movement, right? There's all sorts of organic links between party activists in all of these countries, and of course, the leaders themselves, embrace each other as members of one team. Right? But there are drastic, I think, structural differences that gives a sense that the consequences of a fallout would be different. Right? And the main one is that all of this has happened in a period of no economic growth. And ironically, that puts things in a very different perspective than what happened in places like Brazil, for example, right? In which the first two Lula governments are able to make huge progress, but they're able to do so in a period of extraordinary economic growth, right? Almost 10% growth on a yearly basis. Right? When, for whatever mix of circumstances, that comes to an end, that puts a hard halt on the process in a way that it makes the party in power enter into a difficult relationship with its base and opens up the possibility for opposition and even sort of reactionary forces to enter into the fray. Again, in some sort of ironic way, all of this has happened with anemic growth, right? Even before the pandemic, right? It was just the case that we weren't going to see more than 1.52% growth a year, and then once the pandemic hit, that went out of the fray. So the social pact, if you will, is premised on different grounds, just structurally speaking, and that I think gives the government a bit more, or the leadership of the party a bit more margin in terms of its relationship to its base. Now, in terms of law itself, there's a whole thing to discuss. I don't know if I want to open it up here, which is the whole reform of the judicial system. Maybe we can talk about it on a one-to-one at some other point. But yeah.
Could we maybe squeeze in one of the student questions, and then we have Mr. Targo and the one point question that will emerge?
Yes. Okay. Let's see. Okay, Luca De Cola asked, were AMLO and Morena in some sense uniquely situated, at least regionally, to reframe anti-corruption politics from the left, given the history that you laid out in the article Mexico Rising? I would say that if anything, the context was a negative context, right? This is, as I've been mentioning, a government that goes through the economic downfall of the pandemic, through the inflationary pressure that hits, the global stage in the years to follow. At the beginning of the term, and now with Claudia Sheinbaum dealing with Trump in the presidency, right? At the same time that the pink tide in many of the South American counterparts is at the very least expensive and ebb and flow, if not a full sort of backslide, right? So, so in some sense, I would argue the opposite, that this were really, not a, how do you put it, not good conditions.
Thanks for the great talk, Edwin. So I had a question, and I told you I was going to maybe ask this type of question. But I think one thing that's missing from the analysis of politics in Mexico are the fact that one of the most interesting things about Mexico are the many, many social movements, indigenous movements that don't want the state, right? That don't see bringing the state back in as a progressive project, right? Mm-hmm. They want indigenous sovereignty, they want comunalidad, they want various things that don't have to do with making the state strong again. And that's very, for me, particular to Mexico, right? To southern Mexico, and the movements are so strong. And so how does that fit into the political picture you're painting here?
Right. I mean, one of the things I try to be careful about here, obviously, is to say that I'm talking about the electoral left, and the point behind that is in fact to differentiate it from the left in the broader sense, right? Which involves all these forms of atomism, right? That have the sort of elements of anarchic anti-statist policies, but let's say as opposed to the global north, they're rooted in this long history of agrarian radicals, right, and indigenous movements. And I do think that they constitute a different sector of the left, one that is at the very least in a sort of tenuous alliance with some sectors of Morena at the most, but for the most part is in tension, right, with it. One of the particular things that it's in tension with is the whole mega projects thing, right, which involves, in many cases, state-led capitalist development, right, as well as concerns for environmental degradation and so forth. Now, in terms of the strength of those movements, I would argue that just at the objective level, independent of whether you might think it's not ideal, but just I think objectively speaking, I don't think they're in a strong moment, right? If we think, for example, of one of the kind of staples of those movements, which are the Zapatistas, right? For decades, they have been forced to basically sort of self-contain in the South, right? From what was at some point a movement that could fill up the Zócalo, the Central Plaza in Mexico, and find chapters of support throughout the country, and occupy sort of first, the cover pages of newspapers and magazines. Right? That's not the stage in which where it is, right? And it even have, thinking about the Zapatistas, it even has some added challenges that weren't there a few years ago. Like, for example, there's increasing encroachment of drug cartels in Chiapas that are now in contestation in some areas with territories controlled by the Zapatistas. In a sense, the project to the extent that there was a sort of general coordinated project by the autonomous left around AMLO's policies was to push back against the megaproyectos. I don't think they were successful in any single case, right? And we, should get into the specifics of why, right? But they weren't. Right? And so yeah, so they're in a position of relative weakness, I think, compared to other periods of time. And again, there's some sectors of it, some parts of it that are actually in some interaction with elements of Morena. So there's also a process of overlapping, maybe even you want to say cooptation to some degree. There is some tenuous points of connection.
Did I see another hand raised?
Yeah, so this question is more about how you define the left. And if it's more like a populismo or like what's the intersection, or I guess we see populism in the US. And mostly because I guess, yeah, in some aspects, AMLO can be leftist, meaning, right? Sometimes it feels more like a self-proclaimed leftist. And as a Central American, when like the left won in Mexico, right, it was a relief because we felt like finally Mexico historically has been used as a buffer, right, between the US and Central America, and as kind of like a mega prison in a way, or a huge border. And we thought that was going to change, right? And so is there a difference between his take on like class and then like social issues, or like how do you distinguish what's the nuance?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, so on the one hand, I try to step back from definition of the left that approach it as if it's a phenomenon that exists in the abstract and you have a sort of checklist, right, of conditions for a movement to meet that you sort of check off and then determine this is 9.5 on the leftist scale and so forth. And the reason for that is because, I mean, by definition, left and right are always relative terms, right? Literally relative to each other, right? If there's no right, there's no left, right? And so that means that what is left has to always be, in my opinion, analyzed in the concrete, in the concrete context in which you're thinking about, right? So why do I use the term left here? Right? To me, the basic context in which they're operating is decades of neoliberalism. That means two things. It means a dilapidated state apparatus and a disarticulated working class. Those are the basic objective conditions for the party to operate. They cannot wield it otherwise. They cannot say, we want fully formed militant working class and an effective state in place in order to carry out our program. They have to carry it out with those tools, the tools being no organized working class, dilapidated workers. In that context, in my opinion, the basic historical task of the left in the present is the reintroduction of class politics, the reignition of class politics, period, and the re-legitimation of the state as a social act, meaning the state can do big things. So that's why I think of it in terms of this camp of the electoral left, with obviously important differences, right, such as electoral versus autonomous and so on.
We'd like to thank Professor Ackerman for that amazing talk. Token of appreciation, that was well balanced, rigorously argued. You mastered the combination of a priori theory and a posteriori, go after the facts to produce these counterintuitive and insightful theorizations. I'd also like to thank our rising masters for their thoughtful questions. Yes. We tackled only two. And we'll get to more of them in the weeks ahead. Others might not know, but we pre-circulated readings. And so that's where those questions came from. That's how they were so structured and well prepared in advance.
Yes.
Then, of course, I need to kick off the year by thanking the class team for their amazing work. Everyone, much appreciated. If you all have not seen it, we have a lovely newsletter. You can get a copy. There's so much information here. There's profiles of everyone in this room and more. We also have a lovely poster that you're welcome to bring to your offices, dorm rooms, share with your friends, and use it as a reminder of the good things ahead. I will announce that on October 3rd, we will have Professor Paloma Duong from MIT presenting a talk called Mediascapes of Post-Socialism in Cuba, Alternative and Apocalypse After the End of History. So I think another very interesting talk ahead. Now, I am also very happy to say that we have a small gathering prepared. There's going to be music. There's going to be a non-alcoholic toast. So those undergraduates in the room can stay this time around. You don't need to dash over to drink secretly in your dorm rooms. And I'll just invite you to that. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Take the notes.